Welcome, everyone. I'm delighted to have with us today Professor Martin Puchner, the Byron and Anita Wien Professor in English and Comparative Literature at Harvard University. I am Vassiliki Rapti, and I'm the founding director of the collective Citizen Tales Commons. And this collective is a collective of scholars and artists who work together to harness intellectual freedom and co-creation for equitable futures. Today, I have the honor to present the inaugural talk of a multidisciplinary series on climate conversations, as we call it, that I co-curate with my colleague, citizen architect, Dr. Meral Ekincioglu, with the help of many other members of our collective. Professor Martin Puchner is going to talk about literature for a changing planet, and his recent book is this little book, but an incredible power. Martin Puchner, as I mentioned, is the Byron and Anita Wien Professor in English and Comparative Literature at Harvard University, where also he is the founding director of the Mellon School of Theater and Performance Research. His prize-winning books and anthologies range from philosophy to the arts. His best-selling Norton Anthology of World Literature and his Harvard X online course have brought 4,000 years of literature to students across the globe. His book, The Written World, a Wall Street Journal bestseller, has been translated into some 20 languages. His book, The Language of Thieves, interweaves family memoir with a reflection on Rottwelsh, the underground language of Central Europe, which he learned from his father and uncle. His new book, Literature for a Changing Planet, draws lessons from world literature for addressing climate change. He is a member of the European Academy and has received numerous awards, including a Guggenheim Fellowship, Coleman Fellowship, the Berlin Prize, and the Massachusetts Book Award. Welcome, Martin, and thank you so much. It's a great honor to have you with us, and thank you all for joining us today. The floor is yours, Martin.
Thank you so much, Vassiliki, for this introduction. Thank you all for being there. And so Vassiliki said we have about an hour, and I want to make sure that there's plenty of time for discussion. So I only want to talk for about maybe 25 minutes, 30 minutes max, so we can all have a conversation together. So as Vassiliki mentioned, so I want to talk about this little book, Literature for a Changing Planet, where I essentially try to think about the relation between storytelling and climate change. And the premise is probably one that everyone on this Zoom call would agree with, namely that humans are storytelling animals. That's storytelling is how we orient ourselves in the world, how we make sense of ourselves and relation to the world around us. So I think this is a sort of a basic truth in many dimensions, but I think it is important when it comes to such a fundamental problem like climate change that requires us to think about the relationship to our environment and deep sort of habits that we have accrued over centuries and the humans and millennia. So, you know, I'm not the first person to point out that storytelling is important, including for climate change. I think there's a kind of almost growing consensus that while climate science has become better and better, models have become better and better over the last 40 years, that it's very clear hasn't been enough to create meaningful change. And so storytelling is one of the things that I think we need to turn to in order to translate climate science into meaningful action. So in part in response to that, there has been people, journalists, writers have turned to fiction, in part to sort of imagine alternative futures, to reimagine our relationship to other animals, for example, and the environment. So there's been this field of eco-criticism or ecological humanities that has emerged from that interest. And so where I come in, what I want to do in this little book is essentially two things. The first is to say that what eco-criticism or environmental humanities has been focused on primarily is relatively recent literature, literature of the last 40 years, essentially since we have known about climate change. And that's undoubtedly important. But my point and what I want to talk a little bit about today is to say that actually the fundamental stories about human behavior and our relationship to the environment actually come from much further back. And so instead of just looking at recent literature, I think I want to look at the broadest possible frame here. And that means about 4,000 years of literature, essentially storytelling since the invention of writing, which means that we have, basically this archive of a kind of a world literature canon that we can look at and relate to climate change. And I think what emerges from that is that in some sense, the problem we are facing is much more deeply rooted than perhaps we had anticipated. So this much broader perspective. And then at the end, I also want to talk a little bit about the kind of lessons, as Vassiliki said, namely what if we extract lessons from this 4,000-year-old record of how humans have thought about their relationship to the world, what are some sort of concrete storytelling conclusions that we can extract from that? Now, I should say that this is not the first time that I've tried to take this wider optic and look at huge time periods of literature. I started this habit many years ago when I became the editor of an anthology of world literature that Vassiliki mentioned, the Norton Anthology of World Literature. It's one of these, some of you may have encountered it in college. It's been around for a while. I just became, an editor that inherited this anthology and has since been editing it. But it's one of these sort of 6-volume doorstoppers that starts in the beginning of literature and goes to the present. And working on that with a huge team, of course, of people was really eye-opening for me. I have a PhD in comparative literature. I had thought that I was fairly widely read, but quickly realized that that was not the case, that I didn't even realize what I didn't know. And so I started this crash course in really reading world literature that lasted until today. And the interesting thing that for me that emerged from that, not just then was this thrilling sense of discovery, but also that some of the most fundamental questions about storytelling in literature can really only be answered when we widen the optic in this way, including questions like, when was writing invented? How often was writing invented? What is the larger shape of literary history? And I have to admit that before working on this anthology, I had never really asked these basic questions, in part because when we study literature, we tend to study it in these small chunks and national traditions. So you never really zoom out in a way that allows you to ask these fundamental questions. And in a second, I'll use them in relation to climate change. But just to stay with this for one more second, so I slowly piece together, in some sense, this larger story of history, which begins in Mesopotamia with the first full invention of writing, really as a kind of accounting technology. This is how writing starts in Mesopotamia. But at some point, these accountants who mostly keep track of economic transactions and diplomatic messages start to write down oral stories. And this is why the first long text of world literature comes from Mesopotamia, the very first real full writing culture that starts about 5,000 years ago and then starts to record longer stories about 4,000 years ago. So this is basically what we have now, a written record of human storytelling that goes that far back. I started to ask, as in the questions I just shared, how often was writing invented? Again, a question I had never asked myself and certainly had no answer to. And there, a surprising discovery, namely that all the ancient writing traditions all happened on the Eurasian continent. So Egypt, Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, Near East, and Greece. They're all on the same continent, namely Asia and Europe. And so there may have been some transfer of ideas about writing, or the idea of writing may have spread from one place to these others, hard to prove, or they were invented independently. But we know that humans definitely invented this hugely important technology of writing twice, because in the Americas, the Mayan developed their own writing culture without any contact to these European and Asian writing systems. So this is why I became obsessed with the Mayan literary tradition, because it's this almost like this control experiment, as scientists would call it. What happens to literature? How does it develop if you were to start all over again? Another big picture question I started to ask about the relationship between oral storytelling and writing. And here I became obsessed with an African epic that's not known enough and that I'm always proselytizing, the Epic of Sunjata, an epic that commemorates a West African kingdom in the late Middle Ages, but that was transmitted orally for hundreds of years until it was written down in the 20th century. This, in some sense, and I was able to work with David Conrad, the American scholar who collaborated with Amande Singer, Condé Tassé, to produce this written form in 1994. And it was fascinating to talk to him and learn about how that was produced. It's really the same thing that happened with Homer, 800 BC. So it's a process that's not only in the beginning true of the most ancient literatures, but it's still going on. And some of the most important genres of literature came into view, such as these epics, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, until today, Epic of Sunjata. But the other genre that really became crucial for me was story collections. The most well-known is The 1001 Nights, but there are many other story collections, especially in the Middle Ages, that I realized are really important for our understanding of literature. And then finally, I was starting to think about what are the most fundamental and most influential stories that humans have produced. And among the more recent ones was this text that's not really a literary text, but a storytelling text, namely the Communist Manifesto, that also I want to come back to. And so this is really the book that stands behind the new book I just wrote about basically using that big picture approach to asking questions about this deeper history of storytelling and the environment. And just to give you a sense of a little bit how that works, one brief case study that is in fact the first text that I already mentioned, namely the Epic of Gilgamesh, and immersing myself in this text and reading it with an eye to climate change was really eye-opening for me. The first thing one might think of is, of course, the flood tablet. So this is the earliest version of the story of the flood, Noah and the flood, that we, of course, know from the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament. But before it enters the Hebrew Bible, it exists in this Epic of Gilgamesh. And it's one of these stories that keeps getting retold over and over again, including very recent Hollywood, sort of disaster movies. What's interesting, if you compare the story of the flood in the Epic of Gilgamesh and in the Bible, and the details are strikingly similar, it's clearly the same story. But they're framed a little bit differently. In the biblical story, as you might know, it's clear that the flood is brought about because of human sin. So human sin, they don't obey God's commandments. And so God has, in a sense, creator's remorse. He regrets that he has created them and he's going to wipe them out and only Noah and his family, along with the animals, survive in the flood. So punishment for sin. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the story is the same, but it's framed differently. So here, it's not so much punishment for sin, although it's also the gods who bring about the flood. But the framing is more something like population control. Humans have become too numerous, and yes, they also sometimes behave badly. So there is still a whiff of the biblical morality tale, but it's much less. It's not a monotheistic world. It's sort of one God that brings about the flood, and another God helps the Noah figure called Utnat Tishpin. But it's much less a morality tale. And as I said, it's more like an engineering problem. Here these humans have become so populous, we have to kind of cull the herd. So that, this is where a kind of environmental reading of the Epic of Gilgamesh might start with this famous story that gets retold many times. And we can ask, well, whether today, for example, the story of sin and punishment is the correct one, and there are arguments for it. Clearly, climate change has been brought about by our action. It's helpful to describe them as sins, is another matter, or more like the Epic of Gilgamesh, where it's less about sin and punishment. But that's really just the beginning. For those of you who may not know the Epic of Gilgamesh, it's basically a story of King Gilgamesh, who is a king of a city-state in Mesopotamia, the city of Uruk, and who guards the city. And it's an epic that really celebrates urbanism, urban culture. These are the first cities in the world that emerge in Mesopotamia because of intensive form of agriculture that allows humans to live so densely together and basically create a wall between them and the wilderness around them. And this wall is something that I want to focus on for just another moment, because what happens is that the gods create, so King Gilgamesh is kind of an unruly king. So the gods decide to create a sidekick for him named Enkidu. And so Enkidu is originally a wildling. He lives in the wilds. He lives with the animals. He eats raw food and is not really fully human. And so in the beginning of the story, he gets literally seduced by a woman, seduced into the city, so that he no longer lives with the animals, but becomes human. And what that means in the Epic of Gilgamesh is that he has to start to wear clothes. He has to eat processed food made from grain and barley. He starts to drink beer. He no longer lives with the animals. He becomes human and he starts to live in the city. So it's always about destroying this boundary between the wilderness and the city space. That's very crucial to the epic. And then this figure, Enkidu, becomes best friends with King Gilgamesh, and that's when the epic becomes this kind of traditional buddy movie, in a sense, where they go off to have adventures, and one of these adventures is to kill the monster Humbaba. So this is what they do, and it's one of the central episodes. But if you don't even have to read the epic against the grain, it's right there on the surface. Once they kill the monster, you realize what's actually going on, and what's going on is that they are on a logging expedition, because the monster was the guardian of a forest, and once they kill the monster, they bring back timber. Why do they need timber? To build cities. Because this is because of the urban revolution in Mesopotamia, there has been deforestation, and so they have to go further and further afield to extract resources. And so this is sort of what I just want to focus on here, highlight here, that it's really striking to me that the first text in world literature, which is also this text that presents us with this story of the flood that will become such an important touchstone for several civilizations, and still looms very large, I think, today in the way we imagine disasters and sort of apocalyptic disasters, including those brought about by climate change, is also the text that in a way draws this boundary between urbanism and wilderness, that features this figure who is brought from the wilderness into this space of urbanism and civilization, and that in some sense justifies city building with resource extraction, with the necessity of building cities. So I would say a lot of civilizational habits that we still have are in some sense laid down in this text. And this is just a case study, an example of how to read texts that were written, of course, way before we knew about climate change, way before oil. But I think you already see that some of the habits of mind that we are now trying to change really go very far back and are part of these stories that are being told over and over again. So what I'm then, in some sense calling for is to really expand the range of literature that we consider as relevant to climate change, and to use this amazing record we have, thanks to the invention of writing in Gilgamesh, as a kind of record of human thought and behavior, but also justification of these behaviors. And so this is what, in some sense, what we're up against and what we need to change. And now so this, in a sense, answers the question, how should we read the canon of literature with an eye towards climate change? And that leads me to the second question, namely, well, if so many of these older stories that we find in world literature and that have been told over and over again are flawed, or in some sense justify the behavior that has put our civilizations on the path to climate change, what should we change? What different stories should we tell? And here again, I feel like that, mind discipline, literature, has perhaps a role to play, because we know we have been studying different story types from the beginning. We are less good in some sense instrumentalizing this knowledge. So that's what I'm trying to do, be a little bit applied here, and just think a little bit about what kind of news stories should we tell about climate change. And so there are a couple of different perspectives one could have on storytelling. One is story type. So I've just been talking about one story type, the apocalyptic flood narrative that we know from the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Hebrew Bible, or the Old Testament, and that's indeed one of the story types that's still being used, especially in fiction and popular fiction and the movies. But that may be not the best or not the only way to tell stories about the environment. So, for example, we did a recent environmental writing prize for undergrads here at Harvard, and there's a really talented story, actually won first prize in our competition, who is a comic writer and who wants to become and who's trying to tell not just funny stories about climate change, not like haha funny, but use comedy. And that, for example, that's something that's much less often done because we seem to gravitate towards apocalyptic stories. So that's just one example about thinking about different story types more intentionally, and maybe expanding the range of stories we tell about the environment. So that's one perspective, story types. The other perspective that's, I think, interesting and important when it comes to climate change is agency. Who is the agent in the story? And in many epic stories and other stories, it's usually one protagonist or two. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, it's two, this pair, King Gilgamesh and his sidekick. There have been people to then try to, in some sense, distill from this epic tradition a sort of one epic quest, the quest story. Joseph Campbell was that with the book A Hero with 1,000 Faces, that happens to be very influential in Hollywood. The idea that, you know, a hero leaves home and then gets some help and faces challenges, kills the monster, as in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and comes home transformed. So here, the thought I have is that clearly when it comes to climate change, we are not going to be saved by one hero. So we need to think about sort of collective agents. And there, actually, one of the texts that I find interesting, if you will, formally, is the Communist Manifesto, because that tried to imagine a new collective agent, namely, in this case, the proletariat, and in some sense, brought this collective agent into being through acts of storytelling, I would say. And so I sometimes think about this text because, not that the proletariat, I think, is going to be the answer here to the question, but formally imagining collective agents, collective agency, I think is very important. And when I look at world literature, this is one of the texts that comes to mind. And finally, I think that, you know, the Communist Manifesto was written by Marx and Engels, but on behalf of the small group, the Communist League, mostly composed of German immigrants in London, actually. It's a very niche group that imagined this. But I think this delegating of writing, I think also these days is not going to fly. So I started to think about collective acts of storytelling. And there, another older genre came to my mind that I already mentioned, namely these story collections, like 1001 Nights, like Panchatantra, or Aesop's Fables, or there are so many story collections here, and especially framed story collections where you have many different kinds of stories told by many different authors or storytellers, mostly anonymously, but then framed around a certain problem. And so this is what I've been thinking about a lot when it comes to, well, how should we go about telling new stories, is to think about story types, perhaps not always reverting to stories like the story of the flood or other apocalyptic narratives, thinking about collective agents, and thinking about collective acts of storytelling. And so this is, in a nutshell, what I try to do in this book, Literature for a Changing Planet. And this is all I want to say today, because, as I said, I would love to hear from you and have a conversation with you about some of these topics. Thanks so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Martin. It has been incredible to give us new ways of reading literature, world literature. It gave us the frame with a look at the environment. So I leave the floor open to all of you for questions.
First of all, Professor Puchner, thank you for this inspiring talks and for your inspiring recent book on climate change. I have a question to you as a scholar in architecture. How can research studies in the field of literature with a focus on climate emergency and in particular on climate justice can contribute to our healthy living spaces and built environment creation? And what would you like to say about the significant potential of literature for a more healthy built environment, in particular for our post-pandemic world? For instance, in terms of collective acts of storytelling in the field of literature and its potential contribution to architecture and built environment. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. And please call me Martin.
Thank you.
Architecture, of course, has such an important role to play in this, for obvious reasons. Architecture, I mean, it's interesting, the Epic of Gilgamesh actually begins and ends essentially with a tour of the city. It's very clear that this epic knows that it sort of brags about this new thing, city building. It's a city built out of clay, and it begins by like leading you around the city. Look at these buildings, look at the city wall, all made out of clay. It even mentions the clay pits from which the clay is harvested. And then you have the story. And then by the end of the epic, you return to the city and you get the same city tour again. So it's interesting how much in a way storytelling, to put it one way, sides with city living, and to what extent it's really a product of urbanism and urban civilization. So, this is, you can just use this as a kind of descriptive, value neutral observation. But when it then comes to climate change, I think it's an observation that also has to become critical, that literature always tends to take the side of scribal culture, and that scribal culture is usually located at court or in the city, and therefore has this often dismissive relationship to the non-city space, which then gets described as wilderness or barbarism, or people from there have to be civilized before we can talk to them, and so on and so forth. So this is perhaps one way of describing the relationship between storytelling and architecture, that the two are often work hand in hand, or have historically, that just as we have to rethink the built environment, we have to rethink literature that's often grown up in or been written for urbanites. And so I think to just follow this critical thread, that's why there is much more emphasis now on oral storytelling, because that's one problem with the exclusive focus on writing in literature, is that you, in a sense, continue that urban prejudice, if you want to put it that way. So I think there's much more emphasis now on oral storytelling, which I think is very important. And oral storytelling, of course, tends to be much more collective. These are some of the answers that come to mind, but I think maybe the upshot here is that both architecture and storytelling are really important and often allies in thinking about how humans organize their life, but also the values that underpin these lifestyles. And I think that maybe just as architecture has been going through this process of soul searching, so I think literature has to go through a similar process of soul searching, if that makes sense, Meral.
Thank you so much.
Does make sense. Wonderful. I see Professor Dev Sharma has raised his hand.
Thank you for inspiring talk. It is really insightful in the modern context when we are in the really a very catastrophic situations of environmental literature and other things. I have a very simple questions to Mr. Professor. So there are two kind of things in environmental literature. One, there is just a moralizing or rather apocalyptic kind of, let's say, tendencies of telling stories. And I think this is not enough in the modern context when we are faced with different challenges. So what I want to see is there should be some pragmatics and rather very what to call the realistic approach of environmental literature. So how you think, professors, in this remark? I have just this question.
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you for staying up for so late. Sorry about the time difference. No, I think I couldn't agree more. So I think this is why I started with the Epic of Gilgamesh in this apocalyptic storytelling tradition, and I agree that maybe some people are scared by that into changing concrete behavior, but I think that we have been much too hung up on these kind of apocalyptic stories, and I think people get we get desensitized to them, and they are not helpful. This is why, for example, I think that actually that comedy is sort of one of my favorite examples, not because it's, not because of laughter simply, but because of comedy in many different traditions is the literary form that deals with everyday life and with like messiness and people bouncing into things and stumbling over things and falling down and material constraints getting in the way and so on and so forth. So all the stuff of everyday life in some ways, I feel like it's much better served by certain forms, at least, of comedy. So this is why I loved it when that student I mentioned, came up with with environmental writing like that. But that's just one example of, as you say, a much more pragmatic, realistic form of writing that meets people where they are in their messy everyday lives with million constraints. Yeah. So thank you very much for asking that question.
Really insightful. Thank you a lot.
Thank you. And I see Peter has also raised his hand.
Martin, thank you. This has been lovely and refreshing, and I look forward to reading your books, and I hope we can meet in Cambridge at some point.
Yes, please. Yes, please.
So this has just sparked more of a reflection rather than a question, but the element of oral narrative, the element of storytelling, of even social commentary that comes through that, links very much to the pursuit of expression through poetry that I've been exploring with Vassiliki and other poets recently. And this is something that's come along fairly late in my life in this form, but there's a close connection between oral storytelling and an approach to poetry that's a departure from epic poetry, and that's a departure from metered poetry. And there's so many elements of oral narrative, and also what you mentioned about a comedy. In Vassiliki's poetry in particular, I wouldn't phrase it as comedy, but she speaks in terms of ludics, of playfulness, of playful exploration and reflections on the world and our environment. And so playing with these images of nature, but also our relationship to what surrounds us, gives rise to a lot of playful expression, but it's elliptical, and it alludes to glimmers of stories rather than creating a continuous, cohesive, sustained narrative, and yet it's still storytelling.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for that, Peter. And so, I'm so glad you spoke so eloquently about poetry, because I feel like, and I feel this in other contexts too, that I somehow tend to neglect poetry. And when I talk about literature, I tend to favor, epic and drama and other genres. And at some point, I always need someone to say, but what about poetry? And I think you, as these kind of elliptic stories, I like that a lot. And I've just started reading Vassiliki's wonderful collection on ludics. And so it is great to hear you describe that in terms of ludics and playfulness. And I think that I'm not sure I have much to add to that, but it strikes me the way you describe it as very, very interesting and helpful, because the way you describe both the elliptical and playfulness, that it shows a certain flexibility, that there's a lot of give, there's a lot of readers can use it and apply it in different ways, and it requires a lot of, it doesn't just tell you how it is, you have to be a kind of co-creator perhaps as a reader of that kind of poetry, and that's maybe one can think of that as a kind of almost collective enterprise between a poet, a translator, and readers, because it is so elliptical. No, I want to think more about that.
Thank you. That collective aspect of it is something that I've been very much experiencing in working as a translator of Vassiliki's poetry, but also in doing readings with her and popping out the odd poem of my own. I've been finding it a very pithy, dense, packed way of expressing certain images and thoughts that I don't feel inclined to describe in narrative prose.
Yeah. No. That sounds great. It sounds really great. Well, I hope that you finish the translations very soon, because I want to read them.
Thank you. I was really struck by the use of the Communist Manifesto as a collective agency. I'd love to hear more about your way of thinking, how to read the Communist Manifesto.
Right. I mean, it's sort of I suppose, a formal reading of the Communist Manifesto, which is sometimes why people who read it differently get sort of upset. But it's really, for me, if I think about all the political manifestos that were written in the middle of the 19th century, and there are countless ones that have been completely forgotten. When I compare them with the Communist Manifesto, the big difference is that the Communist Manifesto tells a story. The first sentence is, the history of all hitherto existing society is a history of class struggle. And then it begins to tell this grand history of civilization as seen through this lens of the class struggle. So I think this is really one of the reasons why it had staying power. And it really needed it because, as you may know, the Communist Manifesto was written published in February of 48, but in a way it came too late for the 48 revolution. It was published in a super obscure publication among German immigrants in London. I mean, it had absolutely no effect on anything, and then basically disappeared from the scene. But then somehow people read it, and there's these underground networks, and then slowly it started to be translated into different languages in the 70s and 80s and 90s of the 19th century, and then of course became sort of this well-known and feared text after the Russian Revolution. So in a sense, it took a while for it to gather steam, if you will, but I think this storytelling aspect of it was the reason why it managed to survive these several decades of very little attention. And so that's the one thing I would say about it. And the other is just, maybe to spend another moment on this, on what it means to create a collective agent. Because of course, you could say that the urban workers, they were not created by text, they were created by the Industrial Revolution. Impoverished workers, de-skilling, or everything that we associate now with the first phase of industrialization in the 19th century. In many ways, of course, you could say that the Communist Manifesto describes the plight of these people, but and demands changes. But it really does much more than that. It doesn't just say, oh, here are the victims of this transformation. Look at these impoverished workers. And here this goes back to the storytelling. It coins a term, or it uses the term proletariat, but it doesn't just say, that's not just a word for exploited workers. It's in the Communist Manifesto, it becomes a new agent in world history. And so it doesn't just think of these people as victims, it thinks of them as new collective agents. And then everything in the Communist Manifesto, in a way, is geared towards bringing this agent or this form of agency about. And you can sometimes describe it in terms of class consciousness, or you can think of it in terms of a kind of theory of history. and you can criticize both of them, but I'm more trying to describe what the Communist Manifesto tried to do and in some ways accomplished. And that's really to imagine and describe and bring, in that sense, bring into being a new agent in world history. And that I find to observe how this text in this historical moment and then extending into the 20th century managed to do that is very interesting. And I somehow sense that there's something to be learned here about what it takes to not just describe a group of people as victims, but to turn them into, imagine what it would mean for a group to achieve collective agency, and to how to channel that, how to describe that, how to bring that about. So that's what I think when I think about the Communist Manifesto.
Thank you, Mark. The other thing that I really also like is how, going back to the flood scene from the Epic of Gilgamesh, it's taken away from the scene narrative of the Bible, and it's more about population control. And so that's a completely different frame to read the story. And you showed us so well how all literature can be read through that lens, regardless of whether they refer to a specific environmental issue or not, because as you said, it's complicit to the lifestyle of the human thinking.
Yeah. And there's a big debate, and I'm not sure that I have the answer here, but obviously the environmental discourse today is intensely moralizing, and maybe it has to be on some level. I'm not, I don't want to say that there are, it's maybe important to blame certain groups or certain organizations and so on and so forth. So I'm not saying that moralizing and blaming are completely out of place, but here too I have sort of this hunch that maybe we're doing too much of it, and that's where I feel like the story of the flood from the Epic of Gilgamesh is maybe the better one than the one from the Bible, in part because it does play less of a blame game and addresses anyway. But so that's sort of the hunch behind that. But then sometimes I think maybe in certain contexts blaming and being moralizing does help, but I don't know. Yeah, Peter, do you have a thought about that?
The element in the biblical narrative, in many places in the biblical literature, that give the notion of humankind as having dominion over the earth and over the animals, etc., etc. That creates a certain framework and allows humanity to approach the world with impunity. And I think the fact that that is so ingrained in that literature, and that's become such a part of Judeo-Christian mentality, is really, we're reaping the negative consequences of that. But the fact that that's so powerfully conveyed in the literature, and it's taken such a foothold in our society and our way of living on the earth, I mean, the consequences have just been so far-reaching. So I think there is perhaps some room for some counterbalancing morality to that narrative.
Right.
Yeah. I don't think that we can be completely neutral about that and completely not moralize about it.
Yeah.
In the opposite direction.
Thank you. Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense to me.
So we probably have just time for one more question if you want. I'm really beyond words to thank you so much. It was
thank you
wonderful,
all.
Martin, to have you with us, and thank you for this wonderful discussion with all of you. you gave us some tools to how go back to literature and reread it differently from the traditional way we have been taught, just with the lens of the environmental scope, and also how to tell new stories. You gave us so much food for thought, and I encourage everyone to go back and read this book, Literature for a Changing Planet. Thank you so much, Martin.